This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
We're the ones who don't get the connection anymore because we don't live on the farm. We don't understand what goes on the farm. After I understood and saw how important it was, it's amazing to me I wasn't taught that in wildlife school. They should teach us how important the Farm Bill is.
We go inside outdoors this week with wildlife biologist and farmer's friend Dan Figert to put into some useful perspective the federal Farm Bill and what it continues to mean to wild critters and their habitat across the Commonwealth. All next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund. You see it as a contribution option when you prepare your state tax return. But you also see it as songbirds and wildflowers. You can see it in clear flowing streams. Sometimes it's so secluded you may never see it at all. But if you only see it on your PC as you prepare your taxes, that's good too. Google it and see the difference this fund makes. Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund, the natural tax shelter.
It's time to register for Kentucky's elk hunts. This is Tim Farmer. The Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central and the only place to enter this year's draw. Elk hunting in Old Kentucky. Take it from me, there's nothing like it. 1,000 names will be drawn, and with the Pick 2 option, you gotta like your odds. The deadline is midnight, April 30th. The Kentucky Elk Draw. Enter at fw.ky.gov. Again, fw.ky.gov.
Not that you follow every piece of legislation that comes out of Washington, D.C., but if there is one that hits home, especially for people like us who like wildlife conservation, habitat, it's the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is wide-reaching. Food stamps, nutrition assistance, I've made the list, crop insurance, trade subsidies, university research, specialty crops, and also on the list, a little something called conservation. On the show today, Dan Figert, who is with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, is an expert on the Farm Bill, and for good reason. And he's here today to explain the wildlife aspect of a piece of legislation that, at least on the surface, seems far removed from chickens, livestock, and growing corn.
Okay.
The Farm Bill, to me, right off the top, sounds like it's for farmers.
And it is.
But you and I are both in the wildlife business, and so there has to be a wildlife conservation aspect to a Farm Bill.
If we all want clean air, we should be willing to pay for it, pay the farmer for it. If we all want clean water in our cities, we should be willing to pay the farmer for that. It costs him money. He can't do it for free. You know, society does owe the farmers a portion of that investment that he has to make. Maybe not all, but at least a portion, because we all gain the benefits from it.
So we all eat. So that's a benefit we get from farming.
But there's a difference. He gets paid for the food that he produces. He does not get paid for creating clean water, clean air, saving soil, all those things that are important to all of us still. He doesn't get paid for those.
Why wouldn't you say Mr. Manufacturer?
It's all tied together, I guess. And it really goes back to Dust Bowl air pollution, if you will. When huge clouds of dust billowed across our country, literally, people began to take notice. When the air pollution in cities was so poor because of what was happening out on the prairies and the plowing that was going on, people stood up and said, wait a minute, what's going on here? It devastated the farmers out there, but it impacted all of society. And I can't remember the exact year, but it was back in the 1930s when the first Farm Bill came to pass, and there's an interesting story that they tell about it. It had been debated on Congress for several months, and the Dust Bowl, it was during the Dust Bowl era, and it was a response to the problems that were created by the plowing of the prairies back in the 30s, and then the lack of rain and the wind that occurred, and the whole Dust Bowl was created. Congress was debating how to help these farmers and what to do, and if society had any obligation or not. And there was a strong contention of politicians at the time that said, no, this is their problem. They should take care of it themselves. Kind of like what you're alluding to, I guess.
And if they're going to take care of it, well, they can't make it rain. And it sounds like had there been rain, there wouldn't be dust.
Yes, but there's always cycles of dry and rain, wet and dry periods throughout history, I guess, if you will. We were in a drier period, no doubt about it. the day that the vote was supposed to occur on the floor of I'm not sure if it was the House or the Senate, the politicians came to work that day, and a huge dust storm had hit Washington, D.C. And so the timing was very good in a sense to pass a bill, because all of a sudden it became real for the first time to the politicians in D.C. Now you're talking about dust storms in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado and the Nebraskas. For that to reach Washington, D.C., I mean, that's a national problem that needed national attention.
Well, you can't make a bill in Washington, D.C. that prohibits earthquakes or tornadoes, but you can do it for dust bowls. So what did the Farm Bill of the 30s do to mitigate a dust bowl?
It did several things. One, it began to do research. It paid for research at major land-grant universities to look at ways to do just that. What are the most effective ways to try to prevent this from happening again, or to try to slow it down that's occurring now? So they looked at that. They paid for research. They also began to do some very common sense things, like let's reduce our plowing that's occurring on the prairie. Do what you need to, but not what you don't need to. It created the whole no-till planting mentality, or the whole science that went behind that started with that Farm Bill and the research and the education that came because of that. One thing, and at least in the last 50 years or 30 years, all the different conservation provisions have been voluntary. They didn't make the farmers do it. They were their choice to do. And again, the federal government came in and helped them with cost share. We'll take some of the expense of this, but the farmer had to pay for some of it himself. Now, he didn't have to do it, but he got assistance to do what was right. And there was a clear and present benefit at the time from that. We haven't had Dust Bowl since. And we feel like that's probably because the Farm Bill had done its job. I mean, it worked in avoiding those types of devastating disasters that had occurred. And we've had droughts since then that are just as severe as the droughts of the 30s, but we haven't had Dust Bowl. And so, again, I think that points to the success that we've seen in some of the Farm Bill. And that's just one. That's just air pollution. The same thing is true for our waters. And it's not just the Farm Bill, but the Farm Bill is one component that's helped protect the water. If you look at the way that farmers try to keep their soil in place, not only from wind erosion, but from water erosion, which in our part of the world is even more significant. We don't have the kinds of winds that they do out in the prairies, but we sure have a lot of rain. And so anything that we can do, again, to help farmers protect that soil, keep it in the field, is good for them, but it's also good for us. There's a huge dead zone out in the Gulf of Mexico right now because of runoff from the Missouri River, and our farmers are contributing to that. So we have a responsibility to try to clean that up, and so the Farm Bill helps do that.
Because everything is so connected in the world of nature, it also helps deer and rabbits and songbirds.
It helps everything in the natural world, I guess. And those connections aren't quite as strong as the air and water. But if you're helping protect air and water, obviously you're helping protect fish, and you're helping everything that breathes.
So you have a Farm Bill every 5 years, and this started in the 30s. There was a time recently where you were out on this show, or somebody was, from the Kentucky Division of Wildlife, talking about the Farm Bill, but in October it's going to die. There is no more Farm Bill after, and I can't remember what year that was. Well, everything we're doing with Farm Bill that is supporting conservation and wildlife habitat improvement programs across the state is just going to go away. Well, bring me up to date on what that was all about.
Every 5 years, the Farm Bill ends, so they only make one for 5 years. Usually, at the end of 4 years, they start thinking, okay, guys, we got to start redoing this Farm Bill again. Since I've been playing this game now for probably 15 years, I've seen maybe 3 cycles of this go through. They've never done one at the end of 5 years. They always do some type of an extension, maybe a year, maybe a month, who knows how long, to extend it for a little while longer while they fuss and argue over exactly how they want the Farm Bill to come together. This year, the Farm Bill expired, or the last Farm Bill technically expired in 2012. Well, we're now in 2014. So they've extended it. Actually, in the end of the calendar year last year, in 2013, it ended. And so we went for basically a month without a Farm Bill. And what happens then is it reverts back to, technically, the very first Farm Bill. So all the subsidies, all the programs, all the everything that's tied together to farmers went back to 1930s law for about a month there. Now, USDA didn't change any of the rules or change any of the policies because they had confidence that Congress was going to pass a farm bill by into January, and they did, thank goodness. But if they hadn't, there was threats that milk prices would have tripled in the grocery store by the end of January.
And that, of course, didn't happen. We got to take a break. We're translating the Farm Bill into everyday English as it applies to wildlife conservation. More to come. My name is Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. On the show today, we're talking about the Farm Bill and drawing connections between the Farm Bill and wildlife and places where wildlife lives. My guest is wildlife biologist Dan Figert with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. Dan knows the Farm Bill, and it's his job to know the Farm Bill, at least the conservation provisions. On the surface, wildlife and agriculture seem to be basically unrelated. It's kind of hard to put deer and a cow in the same context. Goats and Herefords and tobacco. Hard to really see the connection. Oddly enough, though, on the federal level, the U.S. Forest Service is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA. Mr. Figert, can you look at a forest and say that is really a crop of trees?
Well, sure you can.
Is that how that is looked at?
I'm not sure if that's why the Forest Service was put into USDA. I don't know the history behind that, but you can sure look at trees as a crop. We have done it for centuries. And to be honest, that's why the Forest Service was created, was to provide, one of the major reasons, was to provide a renewable source of wood for a growing country. And so they were looking at it exactly like a crop. They wanted to be able to harvest the trees, let them grow back, and harvest them again. It's the same. The time scale's different, but it is a crop.
It's not an annual cycle like a tobacco crop or corn, potatoes, green beans. But a forest, how long does it take a forest to grow into maturity? Is it 30, 40 years? What?
It depends on the location. In the east, here in Kentucky, and it depends on the type of forest you're looking at. If you're looking at oak hickory forest, which naturally occurs here in Kentucky, you're looking at 100 years. It depends on the site and the soil and the rain and a lot of other factors, but you're looking at 100 years. You can harvest sooner than that, but if you really want to get back to a full-fledged forest that is mature, I would say in that 100-year range is within the ballpark. And most people can't grasp that kind of time scale, or they have a hard time doing it.
They look at agriculture as something that is seasonal.
Sure.
I found a comment, and I wish I knew from where I found it on the internet, but I'm going to ask you to tell me if there's any validity to the statement that I had found when I went out there and put in Farm Bill 2014. And it says, since settlement time, North America has lost over 85% of its forest, wetland, and grassland acres to agricultural land conversion. What once used to be land is now put into farming. This loss of millions of acres is compounded by urban sprawl, you building your house out in the country, me too, as well as the breaking up of larger natural ecosystems by agricultural production areas. So we had this big, vast chunk of land, and we started chopping it up. It's pieces of forest, you got farms, you have cities.
Right.
That's a good thing, or is that detrimental to wildlife as we've known it?
It's a good thing if you want to eat. It's a good thing if you want, fiber to build your houses. It's necessary for a society that has grown like ours has grown. Now, the converse of that is it's not good for wildlife. I think, you don't have to be super intelligent to realize that if you go out and destroy 80-85% of something's home, it's not good for it. And their populations are going to suffer. There's a reason we don't have any more passenger pigeons. That's one of the reasons. It's all tied together, yes. And is it good? If you like to eat, it's good.
The wildlife carrying capacity of the remaining habitat is greatly diminished, it further says. The foundation of the food chain. Water quality depends on that, and if you have poor runoff from agricultural croplands, the foundation of the food chain, to me, sounds like, well, that radio show has just gotten extremely boring. But this is Kentucky Afield Radio. We're talking about the Farm Bill, and I'd kind of like to know, what do they mean when they talk about the foundation of the food chain, and what's the importance there?
Well, it is the foundation of all life, in a sense. I mean, we all are dependent on those little bugs and things because they feed the life that's a little bit above them. They feed the little animals that eat the bugs. Then the bigger animals eat the littler animals. And
then you and I come along and eat rabbits and deer.
And cows and all those types of things. We're probably made the system a little perverse with our system of agriculture and horticulture and those types of things. We've kind of, in a sense, made a little bit of an end run around it, but ultimately we're all tied back to that basic biology that, you have to have more of those critters underneath you that you eat than there are of you, or else the whole thing kind of falls apart.
So when you think about wildlife and conservation and that part of the Farm Bill, it just seems like you're talking 100 miles away from the same program that administers food stamps. You really do, don't you?
And it is. But there's a reason that they're tied together. And Congress tried to sever that reason this year, but they didn't do it in the end, which I was kind of glad to see. A farm bill passes every 5 years. Back in the 30s, when they were passing the Farm Bill, or when they were looking at the first Farm Bill, the folks who were putting it together at that time realized that, listen, we've got all these rural folks out here that need this Farm Bill, and it's tied to all the people in the city, but we don't have a very strong connection. The people in the city don't understand that tie anymore. And so they said, well, let's put food stamps in with it. And they're all tied together. It's all about food, right? So it made some level of sense. But now you've got not only the rural senators and congressmen out there that want to vote for the Farm Bill, you've also got the city folks, congressmen and senators, who see some benefit in trying to provide food stamps and SNAP, I guess is what the program's called now, providing food for the city folks who need the food. So now all of a sudden it's tied together, and they've got a bigger block of votes, and it's going to be much easier to pass it, a bill that addresses both those issues.
So you have a Farm Bill every 5 years. There was a time recently, and it seemed like in October it's going to die. Well, everything we're doing with Farm Bill that is supporting conservation and wildlife habitat improvement programs across the state is just going to go away. Bring me up to date on what that was all about.
Well, every 5 years the Farm Bill ends, so they only make one for 5 years. Usually at the end of 4 years they start thinking, okay guys, we got to start redoing this Farm Bill again. Since I've been playing this game now for probably 15 years, I've seen maybe 3 cycles of this go through. They've never done one at the end of 5 years. They always do some type of an extension, maybe a year, maybe a month, who knows how long, to extend it for a little while longer while they fuss and argue over exactly how they want the Farm Bill to come together. This year, the Farm Bill expired, or the last Farm Bill technically expired in 2012. Well, we're now in 2014. So they've extended it. Actually, in the end of the calendar year last year, in 2013, it ended. And so we went for basically a month without a Farm Bill. And what happens then is it reverts back to technically the very first Farm Bill. So all the subsidies, all the programs, everything that's tied together to farmers, it went back to 1930s law for about a month there. Now, USDA didn't change any of the rules or change any of the policies because they had confidence that Congress was going to pass a Farm Bill by into January, and they did, thank goodness. But if they hadn't, there was threats that milk prices would have tripled in the grocery store by the end of January. USDA didn't push that. They let Congress do their business, and milk prices didn't skyrocket, thank goodness. But there was that threat there that Congress had to do that, or else there was going to be bad consequences that people were going to be upset about.
You have to put your arms around the fact that agriculture and wildlife are both in the same boat, know it or not.
And you touched on something a minute ago that you have to keep in mind too. 85%, and I'm using your term, I don't know that this is accurate, but roughly 85% of the wildlife's landscape out there has been changed to farms. So now wildlife, it hangs on at the edges of the farms, basically. If you look across Kentucky, if you drive across Kentucky now, what do you see? You see a forest block over here. You see a cornfield over there. You see a pasture over here. But what you see more than wildlife habitat is farms. And in Kentucky, farms mean row crops of corn and beans, and they mean pasture for cattle primarily.
And hayfields.
And hayfields.
See a lot of hayfields.
Right, to maintain the cattle again, and the horses and all the critters that go on the farm. So, it's quite a bit different than the landscape that Daniel Boone walked across back in the day. That's for sure. So, in a sense now, we're really dependent on farmers to maintain habitat for us, for wildlife. Because if they don't, to try to think that we're going to keep the same amount of wildlife on 15% of the area that they once had is kind of silly. So we can't, and we as a state agency, as a Fish and Wildlife Agency, understand that connection, the wildlife's connection to the farm. And it's really totally dependent on it.
Dan Figert is my guest, looking at and understanding more about the wildlife connection to the federal farm bill. More in our next half hour. My name is Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglin in on Kentucky Afield Radio. You can find us on Facebook. Go to the search box on Facebook, put in Kentucky Afield Radio. Make sure you put the word radio out there, or you'll wind up finding the TV page only, but put the word radio and you'll find the radio show, and like us, and you'll like us. Time now for our fishing report.
Hi, this is John Williams with the Fishery Report for Southeast Kentucky. Rainbow trout are being stocked in area streams. Bark Camp Cane Creek in Laurel and Whitley County will be stocked. Also in the near future, Rock Creek in McQuarrie County, Big Double and War Fork also scheduled to be stocked. Those can be caught on inline spinners, any small crankbaits. Also on the tailwater, Cumberland tailwater, we're hearing some nice brook trout being caught in recent weeks, and some nice brown trout also. So give those a try. And finally, walleye should be up in the Big South Fork above Yamacraw Bridge, and in the Cumberland River above mouth of Laurel. They're getting close to spawning time in the next few weeks. Those can be caught primarily on minnow and jig combinations, or also trolling crankbaits. As always, be safe and good luck.
Hi, this is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. A lot of good reports coming in on crappie at many lakes, Dewey, Fish Trap, Carr Creek, Yatesville, and Buckhorn Lakes have all been producing some nice catches. Larger fish are being caught in shallow water, around 2 feet, with tube jigs or minnows. Walleye activity is picking up with some mentions of fish at Carr Creek and Paintsville Lakes, and also Russell Fork River. Lake reports were catching fish with jigs and brush, and trolling shoreline with crankbaits. River fish were being caught on nightcrawler and jig, drifted around boulders and deeper water. Largemouth bass fishing is producing some big fish in upper lake shallow water areas, especially the more murky or muddy areas. Crankbaits slow rolled on bottom, and dark-colored plastic worms. Fish slowly have accounted for some fish over 20 inches at Dewey and Yatesville Lakes.
Hi, everybody. This is Fred House with the Northeast Fishing Report. For you bass anglers who like to fish Smoky Valley Lake, which is located at Carter Cave State Park in Carter County, beginning this year, there is now a 12 to 15-inch protected slot limit on largemouth bass. All bass caught between 12 and 15 inches must be immediately released. The creel limit remains the same at 6 fish, but only one of these fish can be kept that is greater than 15 inches. Sauger fishing below Greenup Block and Dam is decent now. Try concentrating your efforts around the break between eddies and current at depths ranging from 16 to 30 feet deep. Minnows seem to be the best bait to use, either by themselves or hooked to a jig or blade bait. For you rainbow trout anglers out there, try fishing Greenbow Lake as well as Triplet and North Fork Triplet Creeks, as these bodies of water were just stocked last week. Stay safe and good luck.
Charlie Baglin in. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. More on the ABCs of the Federal Farm Bill and what that means to wildlife after the break.
Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund. You see it as a contribution option when you prepare your state tax return. But you also see it as songbirds and wildflowers. You can see it in clear, flowing streams. Sometimes it's so secluded you may never see it at all. But if you only see it on your PC as you prepare your taxes, that's good too. Google it and see the difference this fund makes. Kentucky's Nature and Wildlife Fund, the natural tax shelter.
It's time to register for Kentucky's elk hunts. This is Tim Farmer. The Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central and the only place to enter this year's draw. Elk hunting in Old Kentucky. The deadline is midnight, April 30th. The Kentucky Elk Draw. Enter at fw.ky.gov. Again, fw.ky.gov.
This is Charlie Baglan. We are back on Kentucky Afield Radio. One of the benefits of a program like this is that we can sit down and talk to people and ask simple questions. Why does this matter? What's the relevance? We try to connect the dots. How people like you and me play into the balance of what's going on out there in the wild outdoors. Today we are speaking about the federal farm bill and how for more than 70 years this piece of legislation out of D.C. has been quite the shot in the arm for wildlife right here in our own state. It's administered on a federal level. But my guest, Dan Figert, absolutely depends on the success of the Farm Bill at the state level and his office at the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. Tell me why.
It's an important part of what we do is monitor the Farm Bill and watch it and work with it. We have 15 staff that work specifically with the Farm Bill every day, and they work with landowners who are wanting to improve wildlife habitat on their farms. And that's an important part of trying to maintain wildlife populations across the state. So the Farm Bill has a very direct impact to us in Kentucky and really anywhere in the country.
Joe Farmer may or may not be aware of the impact that his farm, her farm, has on wildlife. Walk me through, if you will, from step one, you come knocking upon my door.
Okay, first of all, you don't understand the difference. The listeners might understand. The farmers know.
The farmers know.
Oh, yeah. They're out there on the land every day. They were raising cattle and raising horses, and they understand the connections. They see it. You don't have to explain it to them. You might have to heighten their understanding of the wildlife aspects of it, but they get the connection. We're the ones who don't get the connection anymore because we don't live on the farm. We don't understand what goes on the farm. So that's a difference.
Kentucky's an urban state. It sounds like it's a nice country place to live, but what is it, 53 or so % of the population lives in the city now?
And growing. We're losing that connection with the farm more and more all the time. And as we do, it's harder for people to understand that connection of where their food comes from. I mean, most people think their food comes from the grocery store, not from the farm. If they don't understand that basic principle, how can they understand that wildlife is still out there trying to survive on the farm as well, and how that happens? It's a challenge to try to keep people up to speed when they're becoming more and more disconnected all the time.
Paint the picture for me or anyone who may not instantly see the connection of how wildlife will survive, as you put it, around the edges.
If you're looking at a cornfield, for example, wildlife aren't going to be using that cornfield much. They might pass through. The songbirds might fly through, land on a corn stalk, and fly off. They're not nesting there. They're not raising their babies there. They're on the edges of those cornfields, in the fence rows and in the hilly ground that the farmer can't really grow corn on. They're in the edges, if you will. What we try to do is help that farmer, one, manage his fields to be good for him and good for wildlife to some degree, but we also help him manage those edges so that he gets the most wildlife production possible out of those edges. And most of the time, they see that as a good, healthy farm and a good, healthy situation. There's some farmers out there who don't want that because in all those edges, there might be deer, and deer are going to eat their corn. And they don't want to give up any corn for the deer. And again, that's where these conservation provisions come in and help pay for some of that so that the losses that the farmer has for the wildlife, which are society's benefit, he gets recompensated for that somewhat.
The Farm Bill is a friend of the farmer, and because of that relationship, wildlife is better in the state. Money is made possible through this $956 billion farm bill that went in and signed early in February.
Mm-hmm.
And among that are programs that are supported, and probably these terms, these acronyms, these initials come up. CRP, CREP, WRP. It's just a bunch of letters to most people. I would like to know about these Farm Bill programs that help preserve habitat that are out there. Just even if you'll say, well, I live in an apartment in the city, I'll never do that, but it's kind of neat to know what's out there.
I'll be happy to talk to you about the specific programs if you like.
Yes.
But before we get into that, let me frame the picture that these programs are in and how important they are to us in a big picture sense. In the last 5 years or so, our state agency budget for all we do for wildlife and fish in the environment is roughly in the neighborhood of about $40 million a year, I think. Give or take. That's not exact, but that's how much we spend on an annual basis to try to protect the resources of the state of Kentucky, the wildlife resources of the state. The Farm Bill, in just the conservation provisions of the Farm Bill, bring to Kentucky on an annual basis about $50 or $60 million a year. So that in itself, just the money alone, is a really good reason for us to be involved, to understand, and to care about the Farm Bill, and for sportsmen to write their congressman and say, we need this Farm Bill. I mean, we need a strong conservation provisions of the Farm Bill so that wildlife can continue to be maintained out there. It is a huge program. It has probably a bigger impact on wildlife than all that we do, at least financially that's the case. So we need to understand what it does and how important it is. That's one of the frustrating things that after I understood and saw how important it was, it's amazing to me I wasn't taught that in wildlife school. They should teach us how important the Farm Bill is. It's probably the biggest piece of legislation that impacts wildlife that is out there in any one year. And yet, most people have no idea what it's about or how important it is to the wildlife. So, first of all, it's extremely important. How is it important? That gets down to the different programs. And each program is different, and each program has a little bit of a different purpose.
You said the annual budget for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife is around $40 million.
I think.
You said that the Farm Bill is valued at around $50 or $60 million. And that doesn't come and go into any state coffer.
No, not at all. It stays with primarily USDA, with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and with the Farm Service Agency, FSA. Again, more acronyms. There's acronyms for everything.
But it seems like the Kentucky Division of Wildlife, of which you are the assistant director, has a pretty big role in the administration of this, or at least to let agricultural folks know that this exists.
Yeah, I think so. We have a responsibility to make sure that they understand and take advantage, for those who want to, at least take advantage of the conservation provisions of the Farm Bill.
Now, how does this money come from the FSA and all these other letters?
And again, it comes in programs, and you touched on a couple of them. The Wetlands Reserve Program, for example, is one of the programs. It's offered through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It is a program that was designed to protect wetlands. Wetlands are another good example where 85 to 90% of all wetlands have been destroyed primarily by farming because those were flat grounds that when the trees were gone, they made great fields.
So they just filled them in.
So they found ways to either fill them in or get rid of the water with tile drainage or different ways to remove the water quickly so that they were able to farm those fields. Now, the problem is sometimes they're not really that good at removing the water, or the water finds a way to get back one way or another. And so in some fields, they might only get a crop 3 out of 5 years because it's just a little too wet. Or maybe they get a crop 5 out of 5 years, but the crop is not very good because its roots are always wet. So in those types of situations, we'll approach the farmer and say, listen, this isn't the most productive field for you. Have you ever thought about maybe putting it back into this Wetlands Reserve Program? What we'll do is the federal government will come in and pay you an easement. So we'll pay to take that land out of production, and we're actually in this program, they actually kind of buy a part of it back and permanently protect it for wetland purposes for society.
And the money they pay you sort of makes up the difference for what you would have made in crops had you farmed it.
Well, in that program, I guess yes, but not directly. And that one is more, you're buying an easement that's going to stay associated with that deed from now on.
Okay.
So it's a easement type program where they buy it and it's gone from you for production forever. But it probably never should have been taken out of production to begin with. And usually the only way a farmer's going to do that is if he sees that, yeah, that's probably true. But he doesn't know how to get it back, and he can't afford not to. So in a sense, the government comes in and buys that land back. Now, he still owns what they call quiet enjoyment. He can go out and hunt and fish on it. He can take his friends out there if he wants to, but he can't farm it anymore. Now, that's the WRP program. So that has one specific goal, is to take lands that probably should have never been drained and put them back into a wetland state. The government comes in and fixes them, if you will. They restore that hydrology. They put the water back on in a natural way so that, it really can't be farmed. In Kentucky, much of our bottomland hardwoods along rivers were all grown up in trees. So in Kentucky, we have like 85% of these things are planted back into trees so that they'll grow forests again along these, and it provides a lot of benefits to society, flood reduction benefits and those types of things. One program. We don't administer it, but we help NRCS administer it, if you will. CRP, another one of the programs you talked about, completely different kind of program, conservation reserve program. In Kentucky, we put most all of our CRP back into grasslands. So what you have is a situation where you had fairly bad erosion. You had somebody farming a hill, basically, or maybe it was a little steeper than they should have been farming. And that causes lots of problems. He gets gullies that are created in these hills, and so the government comes in and says, listen, instead of you growing a crop there, society's going to be better off if we rent that from you for a 10-year or 15-year period of time. So give us that land back. You can't farm it, but we're going to pay you basically about what we feel like you would have made farming it anyways, because that's going to provide society benefits of cleaner water, reduce soil erosion. Now, to do that, you've got to not plant it anymore, but you need to put grass on it. So for 15 years, you need to let it grow up in grass. But let's plant it in good grass for wildlife, and then you can not only have those benefits, but you have wildlife too.
Understanding the federal farm bill is the topic of the show today, what that means at a grassroots level for our local wildlife. Back to wrap it up in a minute. My name is Charlie Bagman, and you're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. Bagman back on Kentucky Afield Radio, and we are talking about the federal farm bill and how that applies to Kentucky farmers, which in turn means it applies to Kentucky wildlife, which in turn means that it applies to you and me, wherever we live, whatever we do. Dan Figert with the Kentucky Division of Wildlife is my guest. The land around us has changed over the last century or two or three. What once was forest and grasslands has now become farmland, and it has changed so quickly, wildlife really can't keep up. Danny, once upon a time, there was no such a thing as Kentucky 31 tall fescue. Now, what's the difference between a grassland and a hayfield?
A canopy. People don't understand how grass can provide a canopy now. We look out across a fescue pasture and we see grass that grows close to the ground, and these...
Looks like your yard, except it needs to be cut.
Right.
Should have been cut 3 months ago.
And maybe it gets 2 or 3 feet high.
Yeah.
When Daniel Boone came across, or back prior to European settlement, the grasses that grew were 8-9 feet tall in some cases. There's accounts of people having to stand on the backs of their horses to see over the top of the grasses that grow. Those are the grasses that were here. Those are what we call the native grasses. They're a completely different kind of grass. They grow later in the year, in the hot summer, instead of early in the spring like the fescue grows.
Never intended to be mowed with your lawnmower.
No, and I don't believe you could. They grow in clumps. They don't grow that nice mat. That's
it doesn't
nice
sound pretty, Danny. It doesn't sound pretty. If it's not pretty, habitat isn't often pretty.
And to farmers, that's an important component. And one of the biggest challenges we have is changing the eye of what is pretty. To me, I can't imagine anything more gorgeous than this huge 7-8 foot tall grass growing out across, rolling out over the hillside, watching the birds fly over, and knowing that there's teeming wildlife within and underneath it. To me, that is gorgeous.
A golf course is a good example, where you look out and it's pristine, it is cut, it is mowed, it is manicured. But you look over towards the edges of that golf course, and you're going to see this rough area, this sort of the bushy, scrubby areas, and maybe you see a little patch of trees, and it looks like somebody needs to go in and clear that out. Absolutely not. That's where critters thrive.
That's right.
And if you had more of that, these grasslands you're talking about, there were no golf courses when Daniel Boone came through.
No.
But if you can get past the fact that, a golf course is pretty if you're a golfer, but if you do like nature and you want the good things to be out on the landscape for bunny rabbits and quail and foxes and turkeys, it's not going to be a golf course. It's going to be something a little scrubbier.
Got to change what you think is pretty, I guess. Again, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the edges. Kind of what we've conceded is the farmers need those fields for production. They've got to make money. They've got to feed their kids. They have every right to do that. So kind of what we're relegated with, in a sense, in many cases, is the edges. Those hilly sides, those wetlands that probably should have never been farmed to begin with, those spaces between the fields. And so we really work with farmers. If you can give us 15-20% of your landscape that you own, we can probably improve it quite a bit for wildlife. And so that's, again, we use these Farm Bill programs to help pay to do that type of thing.
And thanks to the Farm Bill, you can offset what they're going to lose by the money they're going to make by enrolling in these programs.
At least partially, that's right.
When you say partially, does that mean 1%, 75%?
We're talking in the neighborhood of usually 50 to 75% of the cost to maybe plant something. Or you're talking, CRP is designed to be about 75% of the cost that farmer would get if he was actually, how much profit he would make on that field if he was putting it in corn. But he's getting benefits too, so he should have some skin in the game, is from my perspective, I guess. Society shouldn't be paying everything, because if we're helping him maintain his farm for his kids and his grandkids to come, he should have a little piece of that skin in the game too. He takes better care of it if he does.
Yeah.
So most programs aren't designed to pay 100% at any point, because we want that farmer to be paying a little bit too. That's fair.
If you understand it, then you understand it. But if you don't...
there's a whole alphabet soup out there. Which program is best? And they always change. Every 5 years they change a little bit. So it takes somebody like me almost full time just to keep up with the programs and trying to continue to make them better all the time.
In the event that somebody says, my father should be doing this on his property, but he doesn't have a very big farm, is there a minimum acreage?
For most programs, you need 10 acres to qualify. But if you don't own 10 acres, maybe it's not a farm. And these are really designed to help farmers, not landowners who are smaller than 10 acres, I guess.
Let's start to wrap this up by saying farm bills every 5 years will change a little bit.
It's changing a lot this time. You mentioned CRP will still be there. WRP is going to be gone. WIP is going to be gone. Major programs this time are going to be gone in a sense. They're not gone. They're going to be combined with other programs. So their names are going to be changing, but I think we're still going to have the capability to do the things that we need to do. They'll just be called something else.
So don't get discouraged if you hear Program A is gone.
Right. Because
Program B or C may include that in. It's sort of like doing taxes, isn't it?
I guess so.
So people want to take part in this. Where should they turn first?
Most counties have what they call USDA Service Center. If it's not in your county, it's in one next to you. And it's primarily housed there are NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service staff, and FSA. And they're the folks who know how to help you. So if you go to those offices and say, hey, I'm interested in a particular program, or I want to try to improve my farm this way, that's the first place to start helping. If you know that you want to improve it for wildlife, you can call our 1-800 number and say, hey, I've got some property. I want somebody to come out and look at it and tell me how to improve it for wildlife. Biologists will come out and begin to work with you, and they're familiar with all these programs and know which ones should apply to you or which might fit your interest best, and we'll get you enrolled in those programs and get you started. That number is 1-800-858-1549.
I trust you still don't text and drive.
No, definitely not. Ever.
All right, Dan Figert, thanks a million for helping to make some sense out of this, and good luck to you.
It's not fun, and boy, as soon as you start talking about it, people's eyes glaze over, because it gets real boring real fast, because it's so technical. But it is so important. I hope people will listen, and if they're interested, we'll sure call us, because we want to help.
It's been a good show. If you would like to know more about how you can tap into any of the conservation programs offered by the U.S. Farm Bill, you can call the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, or you can Google FSA, Farm Service Agency. We are out of time. My name is Charlie Baglin. I hope you will join us in a week, and we will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.